Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Taryn Kramer, and I am the Vice President of Global Consulting at CERVA. I'm joined by my colleague, Kathy Burrows, who is a Director in CERVA's Global Consulting Practice. CERVA's consulting practice has over 50 years of experience working with global organizations to design and implement customized mobility and relocation programs that reflect best-in-class market practices to support the growth and talent priorities of an organization. We also have the pleasure of sharing thought leadership pieces with the market through white papers, industry events, and webinars such as this one. Today's webinar will focus on operational and strategic impacts and opportunities created by the 2018 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was signed by the President on December 22nd of 2017. We'll spend a bit of time providing an overview of the reform and discussing the relocation-specific impacts of how programs operate and provide support for employees. We'll then shift gears a bit to discuss CERVA's point of view on how the reform may not be all negative, specifically the opportunities that the reform presents for mobility and relocation programs to elevate their role within the organization. With that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Kathy to get us started.
Taryn. So first, I'd like to talk about the operational impacts to the tax reform. So when we look at the impacts on relocation, let's take a look at two components. The first piece is the IRS criteria. So with tax reform, the IRS criteria is removed. We no longer have to worry about the time test, the distance test, or qualifying certain expenses. While the criteria is removed, there are some components of the time test and the distance test which are still really great best practices to keep part of your eligibility requirements for relocation. So we are finding that many companies are choosing to keep the time test and the distance test as part of their relocation eligibility requirements. So rather than having it as part of an IRS criteria part of their program, it's part of their eligibility requirements for relocation. We look at excludable expenses that are now taxable. We're familiar with the household goods shipment, the first 30 days of storage, the pet shipment, the auto shipment, and the full trip expenses like the lodging, airfare, and excludable mileage. So now those items are all taxable components for relocation, and companies will need to make the decision now whether or not they will now gross up those expenses or not gross up those expenses. So they're really looking to their partners with their tax departments, their RMCs, their pay departments to determine what their philosophy will be on how they handle these expenses, and taking a look at operationally, where is that documented? Are those items documented in their policies, and will there need to be updates to those policies? Are the reporting documents like administration guides, location letters, repayment agreements that also have language that refers to these items that will need to be updated? So as the operational activities, not only do we have to make decisions on how we're going to handle these items, we have to look at where they are housed and make those updates to those appropriate documents, then provide communications out to the stakeholders that use this information, like your tax providers, your RMCs, and your payrolls, to make sure that everyone's on the same page with the changes, and then provide communications out to the stakeholders within the company, like your HR managers and your talent management, as far as the changes and the impacts that they may have. So that, let's take a look at the relocation impact. So we look at the things that are now considered taxable. There may be an increase in overall company costs. They may be partially offset by lower tax rates for the corporation, or they may be partially offset by lower individual tax rates. The company choose not to gross up these expenses. This may create very impactability of the company to locate people. So we need to keep that in mind when making decisions on what will be grossed up or not grossed up, because it may impact the ability to attract talent and keep talent if those items are a big impact on the person considering taking the job or looking elsewhere where they may be covered. And we have a polling question today. I'll take a look at what gross up approach has your organization decided upon. Whether you gross up these expenses, there will be no gross up. Gross expenses now, and then reevaluate the program or the policy within the next year, or last choice is unsure still. And complete the poll for us.
Really one of the big operational questions that mobility leaders and relocation leaders are looking to address immediately. I think as soon as the notification of the tax reform came out, it was a big scramble for people to first and foremost understand what the changes are, which Kat has just taken us through, but really to make some immediate decisions around how they would manage those elements of their program going forward. A lot of organizations, as you can imagine, had moves in pipeline. They potentially had budgets already approved based on the old tax application. So organizations really were scrambling in the beginning of the year to really understand what was best for their program. We'll just give it a couple seconds, and then we'll close the poll to show some results. So let me go ahead and just push these for everyone. I think out the gate, we were anticipating to see a lot of organizations choosing to gross up. And we have some statistics just from our own kind of tallying that we can share with you following the output of this question. But we really do expect that a lot of organizations may then kind of reevaluate their approach once they've had a bit of time to digest. So kind of take us through. I think that you can see the poll results now.
So of the group so far that has replied, 50% have not answered, but we have 29 have chosen to gross up, or has chosen not to gross up. 12 has decided to gross up and then take a look at over the next 12 months. And then we have 13 have decided that they're not sure right now what they're going to be doing with their program. Taryn, as far as, well, here we go. So what are other companies doing? So Taryn and I have been looking really closely at what companies have doing and sharing with us as far as what their approach. And 100% of clients are choosing to gross up these expenses at this time. We only have exposure to one customer so far that has not chosen to gross up these expenses, but they also choose not to gross up any of their expenses as part of their relocation program. So the gross up just is in alignment with their overall philosophy of their program. So look at that, we are seeing that 100% of clients that we have access to have chosen to gross up these expenses. Now keep in mind, this is from an operational standpoint, what we've chosen to do with the expenses, but it doesn't give us insight yet into how this impacts mobility trends. Will this additional cost of grossing up these expenses change move patterns? Will it change how we look at people that are going to relocate? Will it change how businesses are determining who will move or not move? So any time will give us some insight into whether or not these changes will impact mobility trends as far as how many people are moving, what people are moving, and what people are being offered. Terry, only time will give us insight into that. I would give you just kind of a little bit of a glance at some of the tax provisions that have changed and not changed that really impact our business of relocation. So the state and local income sales and property tax deduction did change. It went from being unlimited to having a deduction cap of $10,000. And then the forward real estate tax was eliminated for personal tax returns. So the relocation impact that we could see is that employees that are in high-cost states like California, New York, could be faced with paying higher taxes, and that could affect the gross up, which could then lead to impacts in talent recruitment and retainment for employees that are either going to those states or are in those states. It could result in some higher costs to relocate to those states and require some COLA adjustments. interest deduction, there was a change. Mortgage interest deduction cap was $1 million, and then with the tax law change, it has been reduced down to $750,000. Keep in mind that any debt that was incurred prior to December 15th, 2017 will be grandfathered in, which is great. Eligibility properties, as far as your primary and secondary residence, have remained the same. However, home equity loan deduction has been eliminated with the tax reform. So the impact on relocation is that we'll probably find that more of our employees are hitting the interest cap since the cap was reduced. With household goods, there's a change. With the tax law change, the shipment of the household goods now becomes a taxable event, and the elimination of the final trip expenses being excludable has also become a taxable event. Keep in mind, though, that for military moves, there is no change. It's just for a normal relocation that these changes are impactful for. They do result in taxable income to employees for any household goods reimbursements on shipments, and then previous excludable expenses are now taxable if they're choosing to be grossed up. The withholding rate has changed. It was 25%, and it has been reduced down to 22%. And for 37% over $1 million. And so the impact for relocation could be that we could have an increase in over withholding and gross up for transferees whose tax rates are below 37%. From the sale program perspective, there is no change, which was a real plus for us when we saw the tax reform come out. Some sale programs are not based on a tax code, so there's no change to the tax benefits. So the benefits that are incurred through using a BVO or an AVO program or home sale all remain the same, so no impact by the tax reform. Capital gain on sales also did not change. We were all watching this one really closely because we thought that there might be a change, but the employee can exclude up to $500,000 if they are married and $250,000 if they're single. And the residency condition that they live in the property 2 out of 5 years has not changed, so they're able to use this benefit every 2 years. So from a racial perspective, oh, sorry, go ahead, Karen.
I like that last part of the 2 of 5 years. For those of you that were kind of closely monitoring this in the fall and sort of up to when the actual bill was signed, there was talk that that would shift to a requirement to have it as your primary residence for 5 of 7 years. So just to highlight that for everyone, absolutely nothing changed when it came to the capital gain on the sale of the residence, including that residency test that was talked about in terms of a potential change.
So their overview from an operational standpoint as far as the impacts, and Karen's going to take us now through some of the opportunities that are available for us now.
So this is really where we get into some of the kind of the positives from our perspective. You know, I think within our industry, we hear a lot of discussion around how mobility plays a critical role in the ability of an organization to achieve organizational growth and talent development needs and to meet some of those priorities. Obviously, the 2018 tax reform will likely have an impact on the ability of an organization to fund relocation volumes that have occurred or that have happened in prior years. So our expectation is that organizations will be taking a closer look at the value of mobility, the role that mobility plays in terms of furthering some of those organizational priorities, and the contribution that mobility makes to the bottom line of any business. So this may result in a need to review and refresh the way in which programs support relocation, both from a policy perspective as well as a delivery model perspective. We've heard, I think, and potentially taken part in discussions around how to better rationalize relocation or mobility program costs. This is a bit of a shift in the conversation. In years prior, the big focus had been on how do we minimize cost, and now the discussion is more on how do we better rationalize cost. In other ways, you know, how do you maximize the spend that an organization has in terms of value back to the business. Program segmentation is not a new concept. The focus of program segmentation is moving the right people to the right place with the right support. This approach supports the perspective that different moves have different value for both the organization and the employee, and a one-size-fits-all relocation package is not always the appropriate answer. Historically, the ability to differentiate the level of support provided to one employee versus another was focused on employee level and homeowner versus renter for domestic relocations. A lot of organizations are now looking to add additional criteria such as relocation or mobility driver to the mix. So what is the business or the organization looking to relocate the employee? Is it to fill an immediate resource gap in that host or destination location? Are they looking to provide that employee with some career development opportunities, whether it's moving from a large market to a smaller market where potentially they have the ability to kind of manage a team or develop capabilities within that smaller market? Is it the reverse of that, where they're moving from a smaller market to a larger market or potentially to a headquarters location where maybe the driver there is really to ensure that the employee understands the culture of the organization and is really ingrained in terms of how, what processes are, so that they can then take that back to their home or origin location and really, ingrain that within those local resources. What's really driving the spend? Why do you need to allocate spend towards relocation for this employee? Is there really a strong need or business case for that? Or is there potentially a local resource that might be able to accomplish the objectives of that relocation that wouldn't incur some of these costs? Organizations that focus on this type of segmentation approach potentially see some incremental shifts in total program spend, because rather than just looking at a single element within a policy or a few elements of within a policy and trying to identify ways that you can better align costs for that specific level provision within that policy, what you're doing through this approach is really realigning your spend and saying that not everyone is going to fall into that category where they need the full, robust package. You may be able to offer them a scaled back version of that package and still meet the needs of that employee as well as any accompanying family that they have. So you're kind of consolidating your spend towards the middle of your program demographic. So, potentially your kind of mid-career, early career folks versus spending the same amount on your employees regardless of their level or what's driving that relocation within the organization. A lot of the sort of argument or the discussion around this approach is about encouraging the employee to invest in their career. So where the mobility driver is for career development of that employee, the opportunity for them to relocate, whether it's domestically or globally, really becomes an opportunity for them to invest in their career. The organization is investing in that employee as demonstrated by some of the relocation support that they're provided, but then also elements where the employee invests in their own career as well. And that's the big argument for how you can scale back some of the more robust packages and still not, end up with barriers to relocation. You're still providing that employee with what they need to relocate to the host or the new destination location. Policies that adopt a core flex approach. So I think a lot of us have heard about core flex. Some of you even have some of those policies built into your programs. That's essentially segmentation to kind of taking it a little bit further by offering either the business or the employee the ability to, flex that support based on actual need or priorities of the organization or business or the employee. Discussions around better segmenting population or being able to offer some alternate policies that provide some of that flexibility may help to drive some of the discussions or kind of balance some of the discussions around the impact of this tax reform on mobility volumes. Our expectation, our assumption is that a lot of leaders within organizations are saying, how can we continue to support mobility as a way to drive growth and talent through our organization, even though we have these additional costs now associated with our program? And segmentation or looking at alternate policy types is really one way to kind of drive that. And it's a chance for mobility to put that out there as a solution or as a potential offset to some of the incremental costs that we expect to see as a result of the tax reform. One of the other areas where mobility, I think we'd love to play more of a role, and where this, the tax reform sort of opens up a door for us to, and hopefully we can all storm through that door, is really around candidate selection. I think we probably all have or have heard some stories around how, mobility or the relocation team is only brought in at the tail end of this process after conversations have already been had with the employee around the relocation support that they will be receiving. Some of that may or may not be accurate. So sometimes we're in a position where we have to backtrack a little bit and sort of peel back some of what's already been communicated to the employee. Never a good situation, I think, as those of us that have experienced that are aware. Candidate selection obviously plays a critical role in the success of any relocation. You have to look at not only the employee, but also the accompanying family that they have. Are they a good fit for the role, for the location, for the relo in general? I think most organizations do a really good job at making sure that the candidate has the appropriate skill set or experience to fill the role. But I think a lot of organizations stop there and they don't necessarily look beyond the employee. Mobility has a ton of information and experience and data that really speaks to the locations where maybe the family situation, whether it's a very large family size, for example, where that really doesn't work in a particular location, and where right out the gate there are some indicators that maybe that relocation is not going to be successful. Candidate selection, I think, regardless of the tax reform, is key to making sure that we're making some really smart decisions around who you relocate and why. The cost to find, kind of do a little bit due diligence to find another appropriate candidate within your organization is much less in most cases than it would be to replace that individual who you send out on a relo and then they end up having an awful experience and they end up leaving the company. A lot cheaper to, I think, find an alternate resource internally than it is to bring someone new on board in most cases. So, we've been talking forever now, right, about the value of really doing the due diligence up front to make sure that you have the right candidate, looking at, again, their family situation, any personal concerns that they may have, as well as their host or destination location, just to make sure that all around it's a good fit for the organization and the employee and then accompanying family. I think this is an opportunity for mobility to really drive the conversation to say we should be involved very early on in that process. We should be, educating our business leaders or the mobility customers on what they should offer to the candidate prior to any of those conversations even taking place. It's much easier to set expectations when you have all information rather than backpedaling after some things have already been communicated. I think when it comes to the tax reform and kind of using that as a door opener for some of these discussions, it's really about saying, the cost is what it is when it comes to a relocation in some instances. Yes, there are some pieces that we can peel away, to make it, to kind of minimize the cost of any particular move. There are things that we can add into the package that would better support the employee. But ultimately, if the end goal is the employee experience and making sure that the employee is retained as a resource and as an asset for the organization post-move, it really is worthwhile to do the due diligence and to leverage the experience and knowledge that mobility has in the candidate selection process. In terms of relocation planning, again, this is probably one where everyone hopefully is shaking their head yes to say yes, this is always, kind of a core piece of any relocation. This should be happening. Again, here I think mobility is often pulled in very late in the game, and the tax reform provides us another door to kick down a little bit to say we need to be involved as early on in the process as we can. In addition to some of the candidate selection piece that we can get involved in, we also are able to educate the mobility customer around the package options that have. While they may be saying I want to do it as cheaply or as less expensively as possible, there may be some options that can be built into that employee's package that still support the employee, that don't take anything away from their experience, but that wouldn't necessarily be reflected if the mobility customer was just developing that package on their own in a silo without the expertise and the knowledge of the mobility team. I think communications are key. I've talked a bit about just getting in front of it and not having any conversations with the employee prior to the relocation getting kicked off. Being able to communicate within the organization the value that mobility brings and why that's a really key piece of the process to engage mobility, to do some of this planning up front. So again, that you're making a really good, well-informed, smart decision about any relocation that gets the green light. Being able to participate in those conversations, there's a lot of value that mobility brings to those. And again, using this tax reform as a way to say, hey, we know that you want to keep an eye on spend, you don't want to overspend anywhere, and I can really, as a mobility professional, I can really help to guide some of those conversations and some of those decisions that you made or that you make to make sure that you don't spend any more than you have to or that you should. All of this really plays a role in the ultimate success of a relocation, but it's a value add to the business. It's a knowledge and expertise that we as mobility professionals bring back to the business to help make better informed decisions. So cost projections is obviously an element of process that happens or may happen, I guess, very early on in the process. We have 3 polling questions back to back here around cost projections. So we'll just open up the first one. So does your organization include cost projection preparation as part of the relocation process? So let's give everyone a bit of time. The expectation here is that probably the majority of you actually do have cost projections built into your process. There's organizations that leverage their RMC or their tax provider, or sometimes they do it internally to go ahead and generate the cost projections. For a lot of organizations, I think it's known that it's a best practice to have a cost projection as part of that process. It's a way to go ahead and tick the box to see you've done it. But we'll get into our follow-up questions that will really be able to kind of show what actually happens after the cost projection. So right now, I'll share the results with you. We are seeing, sorry, is just closing up. So we're seeing that 28% do include cost projections as part of the relocation process. 13% not include that, and the rest were either unsure or no answer. So kind of what we would expect. I actually thought we'd see a bit higher percentage there in terms of the organizations that do include it as part of the relocation process. And to think about if you were one of those that were in the no or unsure category, or even I guess the no answer, maybe a question that you can go back and ask, within your organization if you're not privy to that information. It really is important to have a cost projection, particularly in light of some of these changes that have come out. The costs that are now taxable, so the moving costs, do comprise a significant piece of any relocation. So being able to create some awareness and some transparency for your mobility customer on what exactly this relocation is going to cost, I think is really important. It's also important just as a mobility function and just for the larger organization to really understand overall what mobility or relocation is costing for the organization, or at least what it's projected to cost. Sometimes people make different decisions around whether or not they want to send a candidate based on that cost projection. So not that that's the primary intent of a cost projection, but it really can serve as a bit of a deterrent where, someone just feels the need to tap someone else on the shoulder and send them off on a relocation. Being able to see what those costs are might make them realize that might not be the best decision. So question 2, which I will open up, is again tied to the cost projections. But does your organization require a cost projection, or does your organization require cost projection approval to green light the relocation? So obviously, for those of you that said no or you're under about the cost projections, this wouldn't necessarily be a question that you'll have an answer to. But for those of you that did have cost projections as part of the relocation process, it'll be interesting to see how many of those are required or kind of approval of that cost projection in order to have the relocation move forward. Here, my expectation is probably that there are not many organizations that do that. We have conversations all the time around process and best practice to include a projection, and the reality is even for organizations that have them out of your process, it really doesn't go anywhere. Or it's a number that people say, great, thank you for sharing that with me, but it really has no impact on whether or not the relocation is given the green light. Often those decisions have already been made, and kind of going back to the fact that if mobility can get in earlier in the process, and kind of build that cost projection even earlier into the process, it may change some of the decisions that the mobility customers make in terms of who they relocate and where. So let me go ahead. I'll close that. We'll get the results tabulated here. There's a lot of us, obviously, or a lot of you that are falling into that unsure or no answer category, and I think that ties back to the original question about how many organizations include cost projections as part of their process. We see 14% do require cost projection approval to give the relocation a green light, and 16% do not. So again, what we expected, participation, I guess response rate there is a bit low just given the original question that we asked, but still aligning with what we would expect. It's a real opportunity. I think first, if you take anything away, build a cost projection into your process. The second piece of that would be to really use that cost projection to, in part, drive approval for that relocation. Your mobility customers or your relo customers should be aware of what they're spending, and they should be signing off and saying, yes, I know what you're projecting for this relocation in terms of cost, and yes, I think the candidate that I have paired with this relocation warrants that type of spend. Okay. Third and final polling question that we have is, does your organization reconcile budget to actual projections? Again, here I'm assuming that we'll get a lot of unsure or no responses just because you probably don't have cost projections as we establish as part of your process. But a real chance for mobility to get involved in this process, with your finance group or whoever manages your accruals. Best practice is to accrue for relocation costs. So in order to do that, that cost projection is critical, right? In order to be able to pass that on to finance to say, here are the costs that we're anticipating for this flow, and you can accrue for them. But being able to do that true up to get to, to really understand what you budgeted versus the actual spend, that is really critical as well. It helps you to really understand, I think, where some of your normative data potentially is off. It helps to potentially highlight where you may have some exceptions to your program that are really driving up your overall program costs. Again, if we're looking at rationalizing costs, if you're seeing exceptions when it comes to, you're not budgeting them as part of the cost projection, but you're seeing actual spend is high in certain categories or even in certain locations, that may warrant a change to policy, and it may warrant, a refresh or a review of maybe you're sending, again, the wrong people to that location, so really highlights your candidate selection process. It highlights some potential changes that you can be making to your policy or to how you manage your program and the types of exceptions potentially that you're approving. Again, we're kind of talking about this in the context of tax reform because we do anticipate that reload program costs are going to go up. So organizations are going to look for different ways to kind of cut back a little bit or better rationalize some of the spend in other areas of their program where there is a little bit more control there. Okay, so 12% of you are reconciling budget to actual, which is great. 19% are no. And then obviously the chunk or the balance of participants are saying that you're unsure, no answer. So we can definitely see those numbers go up. I would hope if we kind of did this poll in 6 months or 12 months from now, we hopefully would see those results a little bit higher in terms of including cost projections as part of your process, making them a key element to approve relocations, and then looking at the budget to actual. So the first section of our discussion really talks about how you as mobility professionals can really better engage with your organization or with your business partners, your customers of mobility, to really move the needle a little bit and get more involved or get involved earlier on in the process, shifting from being purely operational to more strategic. I think we recognize that there are some very operational elements of mobility at the very core of what we do. We're responsible for moving someone from point A to point B, and that will never go away. That will always be a core competency of any mobility team, whether it sits in-house or whether that's through an external vendor, but ultimately the responsibility does fall with mobility. But this tax reform, these changes are really, I think, an opportunity to shift the discussion a little bit to demonstrate and make the business case for how mobility can play more of a strategic role in candidate selection, package development, better education of the organization and mobility customers on why certain support elements should be core, even though you may not think that they should, but they really play into the overall success of the relocation. The value of mobility and the knowledge and expertise that mobility has to engage in those discussions very early on to really minimize the instance of a failed relocation and potentially an employee that leaves the organization altogether. So this is a real, again, I keep saying it's a door that's been opened. I think it's one that's it's a great opportunity for us to be able to start to have and shift some of those conversations. It's an opportunity for, we hear a lot about aligning mobility with organization and talent teams and objectives. And this is really, an opportunity for mobility to say, hey, we know that you likely are going to have to reevaluate, the types of move that you have or the types of employees that you have. You may be asked in a certain business to cut your relo volumes, by a certain percentage because of the increased cost. And being able to have mobility engaged with those teams to maybe offer some alternative solutions that aren't necessarily tied to reducing volumes, but rather maybe realigning how support is provided, kind of reviewing policies to say we don't necessarily need to provide our tier one or our highest level policy to everyone that moves. We do have an opportunity maybe to build in some additional tiers or different program types into our framework that will still allow us to move the same volumes, but potentially just at different levels within the organization. It's a way, I think, we're all, always looking for ways to really develop some awareness within the organization for the value that mobility brings to the table. It's really interesting because mobility is viewed as such a critical lever to achieve some, organizational priorities and really as a way to attract, develop, and retain talent. But when it comes to using mobility, and kind of valuing what mobility brings to the table, I think there's a bit of a misalignment there. So this is, this tax reform is a great way for us to bring some new ideas, to senior levels within the organization, our, key stakeholders within the organization to say, this is how mobility can really help you to make some smarter, or better decisions, that really will better allocate the spend that we have for the mobility program, for the relocation program. And then obviously harnessing the power of data. That's always something that we as mobility professionals have in our back pocket. We have a line of sight to data, lots of historical data. We know what works in certain locations, what doesn't work. We know certain support elements that should be provided to individuals, who have a certain family situation or who prioritize, education over anything else. Or who are moving into a specific area where we know that there have been some historical challenges. There's a lot of data that we can bring to really make the business case to get mobility more involved earlier on in the process, to move mobility from just a purely how do I get someone from point A to point B, just being able to answer those operational or tactical questions, to really getting involved in conversations that say, I have 3 candidates, help me decide who the most appropriate candidate is. What can I do? I really would like to support this individual in terms of, the priority that they have. How can I do that without increasing or without going overboard in terms of spend? We have a lot of information, a lot of experience, a lot of data that we bring to the table, and we're really looking at tax reform as a way to just push that conversation even more than we have been trying to in the past. So that's just to Q&A section. For anyone, I guess everyone should have a Q&A kind of drop down on the right side of their screen. If anyone has a question, feel free to unmute and chime in, or you can go ahead and type if you'd prefer just to do it that way, and we can answer any questions that you all may have. Kat, just flip it over to you while we're waiting for some questions to come in. I know we've been getting a lot of requests from our clients to go ahead and update policies just to immediately reflect the fact that they will now be grossing up versus not grossing up. What types of conversations are you having around sort of that more longer-term view in terms of what companies are what they're sort of wrestling with, some of the questions they're trying to answer in terms of whether or not grossing up is the approach going forward? Are you having any good discussions around that piece?
So what we're seeing is a lot of, it kind of goes into 2 camps. Some folks are very much set on the fact that they're going to gross it up right away. It's the right thing to do. They're going back in within the company and championing with the stakeholders to help them understand why the change is necessary. But I think even the ones that come out of the gate saying that they're going to gross up right away are aware that it could have impacts on how people move and the costs. So they're really kind of keeping an eye on how much the costs are increasing, how much visibility the managers are really looking at it and coming back and questioning. There are some clients where the managers are looking at every penny. So the gross up has a huge impact on their budgets. And so there's been a lot of questions as far as, you know, okay, we agree it's the right thing to do now, but maybe over the next 12 to 18 months, we may take a look at like overall how high the costs really go. You know, is it going to be a hindrance to us as we go to expand our talent? We have a lot of folks that are kind of waiting and seeing a little bit, where there's a handful of them that have already planned out their next 12 to 18 months. They're going to keep an eye on the volume to make sure that the volume's not changing, and if they see changes in volume, they're taking a hard look at the people that are moving and exceptions to changing their program that they might see that they want to explore.
Okay. So we had a question come in around volunteer programs, which is a really interesting piece. I think there are some organizations that do support those employees that self-select for relocation. Absolutely expect that for organizations that do provide some level of support there, that they'll be revisiting that, and that they will either eliminate those programs altogether, you know, or they will just kind of reconfigure the support that's provided. Usually for those volunteer self-select programs, you know, support is already pretty minimal. It's, you know, physical relocation support, so that household goods so directly impacted by the tax reform, as well as where, you know, where it's needed some compliance support. Obviously, not a huge concern for domestic relocation. I think a lot of it will depend whether or not an organization continues that program. Will very much depend on the culture of the organization. Those that are very kind of paternalistic, who already probably have pretty rich policies in place to begin with, those organizations that really want to encourage employee movement within the organization, within different locations, you know, again, they may not make any changes to their program. They may make the change to say for that type of move, you know, yes, we will provide you with that support in terms of, you know, the physical relo, but any tax implications of that support will be the responsibility of the employee. So it's a bit of an offset, right? So they're paying for that move, but then, you know, any kind of tax liabilities associated with that support would shift to the employee. So, you know, more to come, I think, on whether or not we just see everyone do away with those volunteer programs, which I don't think will happen, or just a shift in the support that's provided. And that then may shift, you know, some of the volumes that we see in that self-select space. You know, employees may say, you know what, before where there was company support and I could, you know, exclude or deduct some of those moving expenses, you know, it seemed like a really good idea. But now, you know, I think I can get what I need for my career if I just stay put. So it'll be interesting to see a little bit about what changes there. So question about, can companies choose to have different plans for relocations where they can gross up on one package and also have more flexible package where they don't gross up and leave it to the associate or the employer or the colleague responsibility? Yes, absolutely. So some of the stats that we flashed up earlier during our session were saying, you know, that 98.7% or 98.3% of the companies that we've seen are choosing to gross up. So far, for that 98.3, 100% of those are saying that we're going to do it across all policies. But a little bit what I just talked about when you talk about the self-select, it may be that when companies or when organizations do a little bit of a regroup, you know, once the dust is settled on this, that they may say, you know, for certain tiers or levels of employee, we will continue to, or we will gross up for those elements, but for other move types like a self-select, we'll still provide that support, but the employee will be responsible for the tax liabilities on that support. Good comment, in order to provide flex or segmented policy, decision criteria should be clearly articulated. Absolutely. I completely agree with that. Where we do have organizations that have that segmented program, so kind of that 4-box or some variation of that, the exercise that we always take them through is to say, once you've defined the different drivers of relocation or of mobility, which really is the first step in kind of segmenting your population, you then have to have that eligibility criteria. So is it a certain employee level? Do they need to be involved in, kind of a talent development program outside of the mobility program? Is there a certain level of performance history that they need to demonstrate? Most will say you need to be, at performing or whatever the kind of the nomenclature is for your performance management system. You don't want to be moving your, poor performing individuals. So there is kind of a multifaceted criteria that go into that does become very transparent within the organization, that says, in order to fall into this category, you need to meet this criteria. So absolutely think that that's best practice. We encourage, the clients that we work with as they're going through program redesign who go with that segmented approach, we absolutely encourage that to be transparent. It also makes it very easy for the business or the mobility customer to kind of say, well, in order to, you are entitled to this package or this level of support because this is the criteria that you meet. It's very easy to, if you eliminate as much of the gray in that eligibility criteria as possible, it makes it very easy for the users of mobility as well as for the employee, the relocating employee, to understand why they get a certain level of support versus another. Question about industry feedback about how to gross up property tax and mortgage interest under the duplicate housing benefit. So for the mortgage interest, so that is going to come into play for any newly acquired, the adjust in the cap there. So it's shifting from used to $1 million of debt that you were able to deduct the mortgage against. It's now shifted down to $750,000 total. That cap only applies to any debt acquired as of after December 15th of 2017. So we wouldn't necessarily expect, unless someone's falling in that category, we wouldn't necessarily expect anyone to really be impacted that, hopefully, likely in 2018. But I think some of how a company handles that will also be driven by what the sort of the average property values are in the specific locations in which they operate. It may be that it's done on a case-by-case basis because you may find that 90% of your population falls into that category where they're not hitting that caps, in which case nothing needs to be done with the mortgage interest. You may find if it's 10% in that example that are impacted, you may just handle that on a case-by-case basis and gross up or provide some tax support for that differential between the $750,000 and the $1 million to reflect that change. You may say that, for anyone that purchased a house, after December 15th, but before maybe January 1 of 2019, we'll provide some additional support because this was kind of sprung on you and you didn't really see it coming. But from 2019 on, nothing will change. It really is going to depend on the housing values that you anticipate for your relocating employees, kind of the locations that you operate in. This same potentially for property tax. So for locations where the property tax is not going to push you above that threshold, obviously we would recommend no action, require no additional support provided. But depending again on your locations, if you're in locations where the property taxes are very high and will push most people, I think that's where you're going to see more people impacted maybe in that property tax category. There may be some support for tax, or some additional tax support provided for those individuals. Jim Hollenbeck, I know you asked a question about full gross up on the new taxable spend using circular logic or a lower type of gross up. Kat, I'm not sure if you are clear on what Jim is asking. I was going to ask Jim for clarification, but if you're clear on his question, maybe you can take that one.
No clarification, sorry.
So Jim, maybe if you can type in and give us some more clarification on that one if you'd like that answered. Statutory versus marginal. Thanks, I'm assuming you're clarifying for Jim there. So I think we're a little bit still early stages of kind of having any good stats or any kind of visible stats around whether people or organizations are going on the statutory versus marginal. I think that you have seen shifts in those tax rates, so I think a lot of organizations are just going through an evaluation process right now to understand what approach they should take. Some will just lift and shift the approach that they've taken prior to some of the tax reform and make no changes there. So jury's still out a bit on that one, Jim, but happy to provide some additional follow-up information as we start to see some of these trends really solidify. Particularly, I think we would anticipate in the next couple months being able to really say, out the gate, people grossed up, but now organizations are a bit of a different view, and really reevaluating, and whether that's by policy or tier, and then obviously the kind of the gross up methodology. So more information to come on that as, again, some of those trends or that data solidifies. So it looks like we've gone through all the questions. For those of you that would like to continue the conversation, get some more information, please feel free to connect with us at serva.com. We hope that this has been a valuable time spent this afternoon or this evening, whichever time zone you're in. Appreciate you all joining us. We will be issuing a copy of the recording if you'd like to pass it along to anyone that wasn't able to join. But again, appreciate your participation and hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. Thanks for joining.